It's been interesting because this really did trigger for both Leaf and I to kind of step back and look at, gosh, here it is. We've been together 40 plus years, but we recognize that her first 30 years was, traditional social, expectations, where my first 30 years until we met, I was I was not in her world at all. So in that regard, I'll share a little bit about my family and try to jump over, to where I actually became totally independent, and then get to the point where I meet Leaf in '84. So, so I always like to use this one quote because I've been working on a memoir, and I just read it not too long ago at Unity Church because I did the Mighty Dyke, the keeper of lesbian secrets, at the facility. And so this is what I start out with. I want to say I'm out in plain sight. A lesbian story out of abuse, how I became a mighty dyke keeper of lesbian secrets, and how I struggled over 70 years of always trying to figure out how to get out of the violence, and how I became who I was and how I healed. And my family structure was one of power over their children. I had made it out a very violent family, um, that just would totally destroyed my self-confidence and my value of self-worth. And being queer back in the 60s brought a lot of physical and verbal abuse from my family and friends and strangers. So as a young person, I was always calculating how I should navigate through this world, um, as a survival person of a incredibly dysfunctional family. And then I kind of ended in this little personal journey where Pew Flag will pick up in 1973, uh, which will give me my support of my identity. So I always say, I know how the story of my life starts. I, as a lesbian baby, had been born. I know how my life shall end. A dyke woman shall be laid to rest, satisfied that I had lived as a mighty dyke, the true keeper of lesbian secrets. So that's kind of how I jump into talking about my family, who we grew up outside of the Chicago area in what was the Eastern European, where they kind of all settled, the Slavs, Czechs, Poles, and so forth. And because there was an area between South Chicago all the way down to the border of Joliet, Illinois, and that's where we landed. Now, in those ethnic groups, we all had wars always going on. You turn on a poll from those outside groups, people would all come together. But meanwhile, the Poles and the Czechs and the Russians and so forth, they always fought each other. And of course, the blacks, the African Americans, they lived on the fringes and they definitely didn't come across the border. And the American whites, what we called, English speaking, they would get to the railroad track and that was like, all right. So that was my early years of growing up in an ethnic Eastern European space. Um, my my grandfather, he owned the Slavic butcher store, and my aunts ran the noodle shops and the bakeries, and my uncles, they had gas stations, really right across from the Joliet prison, because we used to hear all these wild stories about how prison people would try to break out, and they'd point to the bullet holes in the walls and so forth. So my imagination of the mobsters was real. So when the boys, Dan Belushi and them did their little skit in front of the Joliet prison, actually I grew up 1 mile from there. We would go over there and play and run around the walls and that. So that was kind of the neighborhood. Uh, my 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 family ended up consisting of nine of us, seven siblings or six siblings, myself, and of course my parents. And even though some of my family did very well, my father believed that he was reincarnated as a Western diehard mean son of a bastard because he was just he drank hard. We lived very, very, very poor. We didn't have the amenities of much electricity in the house. There was one line that came through, and of course, the well water was just outside the front door. Now, that being said, when my dad put the well in, and in 1951, he put a penny in the concrete because I was born. And every child thereafter, he would put a penny for the years we were born. And even today, I still think that was really nice. He did acknowledge us as his own. So that was really good. Um, let's see. So I was trying to decide where to pick up but I thought maybe I should just say that my dad uh, wanted to be an American. He didn't, even though, he lived in this Slavic community, but the first chance he got to leave, he did by joining the Air Force. And he went down to Lake Texoma, a small Air Force base outside of Oklahoma. And he was finding he was an only child, by the way, and he was finding his way out of the Slavic community. And that is where he meets my mother, who she is my dad. So he's the Eastern European Slavic raised with all of the ethnic traditions and the male machoism that comes with it. But my mother is Okie, an Okie from Oklahoma. She is 16 years old, and she meets my dad at the Air Force Base because the southern gals that hung out together would go over to the base and dance and meet the Air Force guys. That's how my mother and father do meet. It wasn't like it was romance. It was just they met. Um, and my mother being an Okie, uh, it's just the cultural. I think that was the attraction to both of them. You know, my dad was kind of suave, and my mom was she was beautiful, and with the Southern charm. And um, they had a quick affair. So at that point, I'd stop and go. My dad now gets a call from his mother, and what had happened was his father, who worked at the steel mill, had a terrible accident at the steel mill and actually was burned over 90% of his body. And so my dad up and goes home. His mother calls, he's got to go home. And, you know, he deals with that situation. His father dies a week later. And that was in like 1950, the end of the year. And then that settles down. My dad goes back to the Air Force, but my grandmother, my dad's father, says, well, he's got to come home. He's the head of the family now. He's got to do whatever. Well, lo and behold, my mother and father had married when he went back to the Air Force. They did a quick civil marriage because she was pregnant with me. It was, that hello. And so when my dad does go back, because my grandmother did get him out of the service, did get him to come back and be the family head of household, he carries back with her my mother, who had never been out of Oklahoma, who had she was the youngest of seven siblings herself, but she was also, her mother had passed away, Anna Mae, she had passed away when my mother was 12 years old. So basically, my mother had been being raised by her older siblings. Um, so my dad carries my mom back to this Chicago area and pretty much plunks her down in a non-English speaking, not willing to get to know you situation. And so right off, I would say that's why I say this lesbian was baby lesbian was born was because right off the turmoil within my mother's pregnancy, I always felt like I was there during their tragedy of my dad losing his dad in such a tragic way, my grandmother learning about this woman that he's carrying home, and then to top it off, they discovered that, which I later myself, that my mother had already had a son at age 15. So she had left that son with her oldest sister, my Aunt Reen, who I adored. But so the dynamics of here comes this family from two different cultures, um, young and really unemployed, and not, it's the war, as I used to say, the war was on. My dad liked to, his family, all of them, liked to drink heavy, and again, my mother, who didn't speak any of the languages, was often shut out of the conversations between families because that was always going on. There always, she was always accusatory of, you don't want me to know what's going on in the family. And it was like, she was right. They didn't. They were always bad mouthing her and how she ruined my dad's life. But, my dad did it on his own. So because I was thinking about that perspective of how to present my family, who part of my family was very, the aunts and uncles and so forth, great grandpas and so forth. They were very entrepreneurial in their life, and they were driven and they loved being, as a family. But here now, my dad marries outside the ethnic group. He married a woman who was a Protestant outside the group. He married a woman with a child. He didn't get married in the Slavic church. Everything that could have gone wrong in their early years was wrong. Then the other thing that I was aware of growing up as a child, and you stages. I mean, what did I know from 0 to 4 or 5? Probably not much, other than feeling the turmoil of their life. But they would move. They'd get into a fight with my grandparents because my dad and mom would live with different relatives in their homes with myself and soon many siblings to come. And then they'd get into a fight, and then they would move to back down to Durant, Oklahoma, where my mother was from. And they'd live with one of her sisters or one of the relatives. And it was never, they weren't like wealthy or anything. They were just, ran little farms, and my dad would take jobs digging burial holes to bury the local people in because he had to have work. And my Grandpa White on my mom's side would always say, "You got to go to work," So he'd hammer at them, and then they'd have this little fit. And my mother would connect with my brother, her son, and I never really made the connection that he was my brother until way later in life, until I was like 7, 8 years old. I mean, I knew this kid was something to do with me, but he always lived with my Aunt Reen. So therefore, if we were at my Aunt Vera's or somewhere, it was not the same. Um, so I used to tell people that, my mother was the type who she stood and cried during Dixie. And my dad was always fighting the Civil War because he wanted to be a real American, a true Yankee, but he always had this hanging over him. Um, so, probably the biggest influence in my life was my grandmother, who on my dad's side, who I totally adored. She was very influential. She was the one that sparked the psychic side of myself, the Russian side of myself, the gypsy side of myself, because as a little girl growing up in staying, she lived in a house that had been a garage. Because my grandpa were going to build the house, but because he died, she just stayed in the garage. It was a 3 room house with a little bath. And so it was great. It was colorful. Turquoise house outside, a lavender kitchen, a pink appliances, and always, it just felt very homey. But one thing I knew was I would go into her bedroom. Because she'd have us curl up and sleep with her, and she'd say, "Don't bounce on the bed." And at first, you never think about it, but as you grow, I discovered that she'd always had a Seagram 7 whiskey bottle up under her pillow because she dealt with her loss that way. She would drink. She'd put us little kids, myself and my siblings, next to, where she was going to lay down. She'd just pat us. And then she'd start telling us the stories about those that had died and the spirits and how they come and how to talk to them, how to pray with them. She had an altar set up in her corner, which I have today in my own home. She had an altar of the Black Madonna because she, again, the Russian Orthodox side of her, Gypsy side of her, kind of had a different way of honoring their saints, and the Virgin at that point was black. And so you'd go in, it was always spooky because the candles were lit, the shades were down, and you'd go up and she'd tell you what to do, and you'd talk to the dead, and you'd call them in, and then you'd go to sleep. And then every so often she'd wake and go, she'd start talking to my grandpa or something. And so that's what kind of tantalized my interest in the psychic side of things with her. And she's also the one that taught me how to read tarot cards from a standard deck. She also was one who taught me how to read the weather outside and what to expect and what was going to happen, and how just to call on spirits. So, that was kind of my influence there. So I could I think I was around 7 years of age. We're still living in the Slavic area. By that time, my uncle George finally said, "You got to have a house." So he built my dad and all of his buddies and my family in the Slavic neighborhood built a little 4 room house, no hallways or anything. And that became our place to live. And when that happened, that's when I discovered I had a brother that was going to live with us full time. Because then my mother actually said, "Bring him here. He needs to go to school," and so forth. And it was really a kind of a shocker, because he was this little Southern kid and he didn't talk like us. He didn't look like us really. He looked more like the a different side of the family. And so the war that took place between my folks, now I found myself warring between this brother and myself because I always perceived myself as the oldest sibling. And my dad always recognized me as the oldest sibling. And he didn't really, he had my brother come, but he didn't really totally embrace him till I think it was around 12 years of age before he totally embraced my brother. And so there
Was
was
it
also,
crowded in the house with
oh,
so many kids?
crowded is an understatement. So as we girls grew, we slept in a one bed because it ended up being 6 of us, 6 girls, and we slept crisscross, head, foot down, and my brother slept on a cot against the wall. So that was our room, and just walk around the corner. That was my folks, and then we had the living room where they had a fireplace and a wood burning stove for heat, and then you had just this little kitchen. It was really it was sufficient. It was fine. I didn't know much better, but again, looking back, it was incredible. We were incredibly poor. By choice. I always said my mother and father selfishly didn't have a lot of ambition. The monies they made, they drank. There was the local, we had in every community, not every, but many communities up in that area all had their taverns, the family tavern. I mean, right next door to my grandmother's was a tavern. Right across the field from where our little house was built was a tavern on the backside. So there was always a lot of drinking and card playing and ugly going on, and and the kids we were we were incredibly uh poor. I just keep saying poor, but really we were dirty. We didn't have many manners. We would run till our legs were tired and just collapse in the house. So, was it tight in the house? Yeah. We primarily our cousins and so forth would make sure that they would bring food and so forth over. We received the welfare foods, that big jars of spam. Oh, I even hate the smell of spam when it's cooking, or peanut butter in gallon buckets, and oh, Yesico honey. It was a trying time in the sense of growing up, because again, my I could see my uncles and aunts. They had running water. They had electricity. They were clean. We were not. And
Did you have a sense of family or a sense of community?
we had a sense of our community, the Slavic community, because we were somehow, everybody's sort of interrelated. My grandmother had, like 10 siblings, and my grandpa, Clem, he had maybe 15, um, brothers and sisters. And that's the other thing. See, so when my grandmother lost her husband, my grandpa Nadelsky, um, my dad picked out the new husband for his mother.
Wow.
And that's what you had to do. She couldn't live alone. She had to have a man. And so my grandpa Clem Pamakala, who was my step grandpa, the one I really only always knew, Tag, he was it. And he was a wonderful guy, but again, he fell into the same, patterns of too much drinking and too much fighting. And because my mother hated living among she'd call it these people, your people. It was like she never birthed us kids. She would reference us as your family, you're this and that. And they just always fought, like I said, the Civil War never ended in our house. It was just, my grandmother disliked her from the get-go, and it never changed. And my dad, he was just who he was, and he really, if anything, they just went downhill together through life, being irresponsible. So, um, yeah, it was an interesting growing up with watching the interaction. But I did feel, I will say, I was always grateful I was the oldest of my five sisters, because my mother was at least still with us, and the family was still around us. But as we aged, you could see the push away. It's like that sort of happened that way. So I went to because I was thinking about, that's what Leaf and I were talking about, was it wasn't that uh, I, I I lived in this area. I went to school in this area with the same type of people up until I was around um, junior high age, somewhere in there. And my mother, and didn't even talk to my dad. My mother decided that she was going to coax one of my uncles into buying a house across the bridge, across the railroad tracks, in what was considered working class white neighborhood, white America. Uh, and I remember thinking, I mean, and she did it. And when my dad came home, because he worked also for a construction company that my uncles owned, Arbanis, and they would sit about a town building water tanks. My dad came home to discover she had bought this house. My uncles bought the house. So we moved out of the ethnic neighborhood when I was a teen into suburbia white America where running water and I mean we all went into the place and I this you think we all stood there around the toilet watching it flush because we were now in a 3 bedroom house with a living room and dining room and a kitchen. We were like, whoa, we have arrived. The excitement of that was great. The disappointment of that was, we were white trash coming into that neighborhood, and that's how we were treated by many of the neighbors, and rightfully so. I mean, these neighbors, it was just, nice kept lawns and so forth. But my folks, I mean, they would get fights and burn up the mattresses and throw them out in the yard when they fell asleep drunk. And the neighbors would just go, "Oh, I can't stand these people." The police were always there, always being called, and um, but it was, yeah, so that was a good change in the sense that, I'm now seeing a different culture of how people live, that I didn't need to be so afraid of these people that were on the other side of the railroad track. At the same time, I saw the discrimination up close of being an unkept person. Families that didn't, utilities would be shut off, and the truancy board, because we didn't go to school enough, would come knock and things like that. Where before that wasn't an issue.
What was it
So,
like for you at school? What was it
well,
like
I
being with
was
the teachers and with the other children?
Well, the younger years, I actually there was a lot of because there were so many of us that didn't speak English. It was like we had teachers that spoke the Slavic languages, and so they would go between English and the Slavic languages. So in a way, I got some good teaching. Uh, but the other side of it was we didn't have to always go to school. And so if my mother didn't want to get us dressed, we didn't. If they'd had a rough night with whatever, uh, we just stayed home. So I was not by any stretch a student. I didn't really learn to read till way later in my life. And when I say later, I'm saying in my later, like closer to 20 years of age. And so I didn't have the educational support. I went to when we went to the suburban neighborhood and I went into school. I actually was put in special ed classes, special educational classes, because I couldn't read or write. And I was a teenager, could not read or write. I took what they call remedial uh, reading, and I failed it. And that's in high school. So I just school was only for me a haven of rest. If I went, it was because I needed to get some sleep, and because again, being the oldest, I did also become the built-in babysitter of my siblings. If my folks, my mom did get a job at that point, in high school, but she'd rather go to work and deal with her kids. And so, tag, you're it. Your sister's sick, you need to stay home. Your sister's got the measles, you need to stay home. That was the other thing. If one of us got anything, my mother would expose us to everybody. So when one got the chicken pox, we all got it. One got the measles, we all got it. Deliberately sometimes, and but to give you an example of the cleanliness issues, because I still have this little thing about got to clean the kitchen counter. Everything's got to be clean. Was we had lice as kids, so we'd get our heads shaved from time to time. We had what they call rot mouth, where you would from the dirt net, they would have to paint our inside of our mouths with some type of purple uh, liquid medication because it was, that's how funky we were. We were just,
Dancing Violet.
yeah. So yeah.
How did the other kids treat you at school?
Well, so for myself, because I was in the special ed class, because I'll pick up. This is probably a good spot to pick up where the age and the independence starts coming in.
Yeah.
But in high school, I was put in this special ed class with about 30 others. Now, special ed meant if you were autistic, if you had fits of tantrum, um, if you were blind, if you were handicapped, all of us were put together, and there was about 30 of us. We went through all of high school together. We didn't have to buy our books. We didn't have to do homework assignments. We, my English teacher was blind. He was the first Black English teacher in the school that we were going to now, and he got we were his. All right, you can teach at this white school, but you're going to teach these kids. And, here he was handicapped himself. He was disabled, but he was a teacher. He was smart. I still remember him teaching us kids how to slither on the floor like a snake and then spell the word. That's the type of, he'd play with us. Um, so yeah, the kids, the overhaul kids, because the school I went to actually was almost 2,000 students. So I go from the ethnic school of probably so many hundred up in the rural area of this community to the suburb area where every age group was about 400 to 500 students. So, but in my age group, there was only the one class of the disabled or special ed students, and I was one of those in that class. And so from that, since I went all the way through school with the same kids, the only difference was there was also art classes because you took different things. I didn't have to go to standard classes, but I could go to art classes, and a lot of rebellious kids were in art classes. So I did become friends with them, which was good, and we did hang out. I did learn how some of these families were very well to do, lawyers and doctors. And so I got to go to their houses and I got to see a different world that I had no idea was out there. I mean, it was like, wow, I mean,
What
so
was that like for you?
um, I was jealous. I was always thinking, damn, you got it made. You got it your own bedroom. I mean, it was just economics class, the class difference. And so the other thing I wanted to bring up, I was thinking about this, was so that was like 1966 is when I was going into high school and all this changing of realizing that I was now a little white American girl in a suburban world and, trying to navigate it. And because I was not a reader, but I was very drawn to art, um, I, I was beginning to do this little dance of trying to create who and what I was going to be. And one thing that happened in that neighborhood was there was how Jehovah Witnesses come knocking at your door, say, "We want to take your kids to church." Well, some Southern Baptists came knocking at our door in Marycrest in '66 and said, "We want your kids to go to camp through this Bible school." And my folks actually let me go. which was shocking because up till then I'd had no freedoms. I was always the babysitter, the one that, you get me this, do that, yada, yada. I mean, even to the point where when I got my first car hop job at 15, my tips went to pay for the electricity or the water bills or their beer, or cigarettes. But they let me go to this summer camp for a couple of weeks. First time ever. I probably smelled the high heaven, but there was a woman there, Margaret, who was older, who knows how much older, but she took me on at that camp, and it was like, wow, a wonderful thing happened. She didn't talk down to me. She said, "This is how you brush your teeth. This is how you, just tie your shoes, and this is how you make friends, and this is how you do arts and crafts, and this is how you get along." And that was in '66. So it affected me that that enough that every year from then on, I did go to the camp until to the point that I actually became on the board of Pioneer Girls in my 20s. I was still going to facilitate in some way in that camp because of this woman, Margaret's influence.
How did that change your life at home?
Um, I was beginning to assert my "I'm going to go do my own thing" attitude. And no, I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. And my mother would do the what they call knuckle fist, on the head to say you're going to do what I tell you. And it was the first real physical fights that were going on. But my dad and I were always there was always um, some type of battle between us because he was just so determined to make me like him that it was kind of sad in its own right. But the thing that happened in uh, my sophomore year, my dad wanted me to quit high school and get married. It was time. He married his mother off. It was time to start marrying off his daughters. And I told him, I knew this about myself already. I told him I was never going to marry his kind. I was marrying one of my girlfriends.
Uh,
And the second I did that, he went into this violent rage. And this was when I first heard the term bull dyke. He
uh,
called me a bull dyke and he was going to beat it out of me. And as he was doing his thing with the broom handle, that's the first time my mother ever stepped in to stop him. Up till then, it didn't matter. He could slap us kids around all he wanted. But because it was so violent, um, and I was so determined, it was like, I am never coming back in this space as this do as you tell me. I will endure this, but the first chance I get, I'm leaving. And so I started running the streets. I was 16. I was running the streets. I had a cousin who was like 4 or 5 years older than me, who was gay, who lived up in the area, and he kind of took me under his wings. He actually, encouraged me to go on out there and find your friends that are like you, and I did. I mean, I met my first lesbian stripper at 16 in a Chicago bar. And she'd come up and she'd pinch us and she'd call us little dykes, little butches, she'd play with us. And, it was like we were like kids in a candy store. And so I was learning about myself. And by 1968, when the Chicago protest was going out up in Chicago for the convention, I went with my cousin Johnny and I learned about protesting adults, protesting their laws, protesting their demands over us to the point that it would threw me in me to where I carried it home. And it was like anything any adult said, if I didn't like it, I wasn't participating with you. I just get ugly with them. And so I was pretty determined. Now, I will say that because of the situation where my mom and dad had to fight over whether I was getting married or finishing high school, my mother, who never finished high school, who wished she had, uh, did ensure that I did get a degree, graduated at the very bottom of the class. Couldn't spell the word diploma if I had to, but I got the certificate. And the second I got that certificate, I mean, literally with a little brown bag, I still remember shoving a few things in there of little trinkets that I had saved in my life that were special. And I moved out, and I moved in with my cousin's friend, she was a prostitute. He had told her I was a little baby dyke, and it was above a tavern. And I moved in with her. I had to pay her so much money. I slept on the couch. And when she had her clients in, I went downstairs and would sit at the bar until her clients left, and you know, that's, how I broke away from home. I broke
How
away.
did you get the money to pay her?
I did odd jobs.
Yeah,
I mean, I worked at a nursing home for a while, serving meals. I also worked, because again, you don't have to read. All you have to do is go in and say, I need a job. And as a kid, nursing homes were the best place. They always need somebody to do laundry. I could laundry, I could cook, I can clean, I could swing a mop. I didn't have any skills outside of that. So my jobs for a long time were in that realm of just being a good servant, you know.
yeah, yeah.
So, but one of the things I was aware of, because again, growing up in the family I grew up in, where too much drinking and my folks now had gotten heavy into drugs and things, was I was beginning to see myself slide down that road. I was running the streets, I was going up to Chicago, I was hanging out with the artist and other dykes like myself. I never had relationships because I was one of these don't touch me. I was so from the violence of my life, I was a do not touch me person. And I was also quick to temper. So if something was going wrong, if I felt it injustice, I was quick up on my feet. So, but somewhere along the line around in the early 70s, I had decided I came in and I told the gal that I was tired of sleeping on the couch and falling down drunk and so forth. I said, I'm out of here. And Meryl, I, who, I would buy cars for $5 and $10 and run them until they fell apart, and I'd leave them along the side of the road and go buy another car. All I had to do was be able to leave enough tires in the back trunk to change a flat.
Yeah.
And so I had this old car, and gosh knows, I put myself in it, and I went south. I drove out of Joliet, said bye to everybody. I must have been half out of my mind, I think, but I went south and I landed in the St. Louis area because I knew that's where that Margaret that I met in 1966, she lived in this little town, and I was going to go find her.
The woman from Cam.
Yep, I was going to go find her,
Wow.
and I was going to tell her what I needed. And that's exactly what I did. That was the flower child period. So you can go down to an area and there's always commune somewhere, flower child commune. So I found a commune right off. If you smoke pot or whatever, you knew where to go. So I landed there. The people kind of gave me some advice how to look for this person, and I went and searched, and I found her at the church that I knew that she went to,
Ah,
and I walked in that door and said, I'm here. I don't know what I
ah,
thought, but I'm here, and I needed help and I needed change. Otherwise, I was going to jail. I was going to either kill someone, I was going to kill myself or something, to the point that I was ready. I needed that mentorship. And she was just like in camp. She was not a lesbian. She was just a good person. And she said, okay, now she took me in, but she also took it one step further. She introduced me to a Christian family of her church who had two little kids, and the Stevens were their name. And she told them my situation, told them I wouldn't be an easy person, but I was willing, and would they let me live with them? And they said yes.
Psychic convergence.
Totally, totally.
Yeah, yeah,
uh, and I lived with them and got a job at the nursing home just up the road so that I could pay. I agreed to pay them like $20 a week or whatever it was. And the nursing home guy, because now my car broke down again, but the nursing home guy said, I'll take it out of your check. You go buy this little car. So he helped me get a car so I could go back and forth. And he would take it out of my check, the payments, and then I had enough to pay them. And then their kids taught me how to read.
wow.
So Liz would tell the kids, now you sit down with Drea and you're gonna read. Y'all are gonna read. And for the next year or so, that's what I did.
How
Uh,
old are the kids?
Uh, they were, oh gosh, they were probably, 9, 11.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
young. They were fascinated. I was somebody so different from them. I mean,
yeah,
this person, it was like a Martian dropping in, and I was fun. I mean,
yeah,
when I wasn't in this situation of my family, I was fun because I love life. I love
yeah,
everything about the world that I was learning, and so it was exciting. And
yeah,
I was willing to change. I was willing to be this person I wanted to be.
yeah.
And they weren't pushing me into marriage. They were pushing me into, be a Christian and do whatever. But I was influenced by them, and I was influenced by Margaret. And I did end up during that period of time. I joined the Latin American missions, and I did go serve over in Mexico as a missionary. And with the understanding, this is what they did. The church said, if because Margaret, again being older, she said, I'll need somebody to go with me and work with the orphan kids. And I right along because I'm still learning. And the church paid for us to go there, covered all of our expenses, and took us on for being their missionaries. And I learned a lot.
Yeah.
And then the agreement was that when I came back, I discovered, I didn't know at the time, but I did discover it. Liz and Ron had gone to school with the president of Calvary Bible College in Kansas City,
And
Missouri.
Liz and Ron were
The family I lived with,
the
that
parents.
the parents, the
Okay.
parents, and those parents, when we got back from the mission field, called up their president of this college and said, "We have this young girl, me, can't read or write, not well, but she's spunky and she's a quick learn. Uh, will you accept her in school?" And he said, yes. So I entered college without any credentials, without any means of whatever. And and they even managed to get me a scholarship for my disability of learning. They figured out how to get some monies to help pay to get me in that school. And I went. I went to Kansas City. Again, here's my little brown bag. I didn't
Yeah.
have a hell of a lot. And I put myself in that school because it was a school that it wasn't heavy Christian at the time that I went. It was a because it was teacher certified. It was where you could actually get certification, and I thought I could get certification in camp recreation. I
Yeah.
didn't understand how it all worked, but I knew that if you got training, you could get this, and then you can get paid and make more money and whatever. And so at the time I joined the school, it was great. Unfortunately, and that's the unfortunate part, was that president was voted out,
Uh,
board changed, and they decided, I wrote this down, the school that was now just a nice school that really helped people, it was now they had a mandatory agreement had to be signed by students not to participate in any homosexual groups, or those
oh,
or those that accepted them into churches would be part of the new standard of acceptance to continue on in the school.
why
Now,
did that come up like that, do you think?
they changed the whole board. The money people of the board decided that it was going to be a religious school,
Yeah,
not just an open school to anybody who wanted to come and get their degrees. And so, in that regard, um, I had one full year of wonderful teaching, but
yeah,
uh, it all changed. But at that point, it was a situation where I I I knew that I was a dyke. I knew that I was a lesbian. I'd already met people there in the community that in that very school, Doug and Mike and a few others, they were gay men. I mean, we felt totally comfortable in that environment of the school. But
yeah.
once that happened, we had to sign the agreements. Those of us, we left. So, no, I said, can't stay here.
So they were purging themselves because
Yes, kind
they
of like
must have been
today.
aware of that. Yeah.
Kind
Huh.
of like,
Okay, go ahead. And then,
no, it was kind of like today. So then what I did was this is so is by 1973, P flag came around in Kansas City at the Presbyterian Church. And it was there in Midtown, close to where I now lived, in a house with two gay guys, a lesbian, a couple of other artists. We all lived in this one big house. But I discovered just up the road it was this new P flag, parents and lesbians. Anyway, what was nice about it is I went there. I was a kid. I was still, young. And so they had little circle groups that they would put you in. You get to talk about your families and acceptance. My family at that point, we were really very distant. I would go see them maybe once a year, if that. I mean, I was not, they weren't coming to visit me. I wasn't visiting them. Our lives had really gone different ways, but they helped me get focused about going to a community college. And at that point, again, what type of work did I do? I did clean out people's garages, whatever junk work I could do to get, I did. And it was also during that time that I did meet an older man that took me on to pull boilers out of apartment buildings because he needed somebody he could boss around. And I was young and strong. I could do it. He'd pay me, $5 an hour, and I could go to school.
uh,
So I had a job learning some. Now I'm starting to learn some trades. I'm going to Penn Valley Community College, where they had art classes, and they also had HVAC tech classes. So I was taking those, and I was going between them. I was dancing between them. But because I was an out lesbian, there was panel groups that I got invited on to go sit with, the drag queens and, other out. Those of us that were out were in demand in the
yeah,
early 70s. Come tell us about how you're being discriminated against. Talk to
yeah.
us. And I and from there I landed over at MCC 1975. Troy Perry had come and started a church there in Midtown where I lived, where the Penn Valley College was. Everything was kind of coming together. And so I got involved with MCC, the Metropolitan Community Church. And I think his name was, oh, I'll have to think about it. But he was John Bola, uh, and he ran the church, and he encouraged us. Like I played on a softball team for the church with the open leagues that were out in the Parks and Rec. We'd get booed and hollered at, but we had a ball. Here's this lesbian ball team playing. Um, then the other thing that came out of the MCC was there was a women's liberation union that used that space to do like the first ever gay pride openly in Kansas City. So I got to do that. I was part of that. I was being pulled in, which was I liked. I was very, you know, if you needed somebody to go protest with, I was your gal.
Yeah,
I'd go. And I think it was in 76, they had the protest against the Republican convention, National
yeah,
Convention.
yep,
And once again, those of us who were out were really out. What did we have to lose? Our careers. We didn't have any careers. We were cleaning friggin' toilets. And
right.
uh, uh, but then in 77, that was the first uh, gay pride in Kansas City. And that's where I was on Leah Hopkins organized it through Christopher Street. And Leah, who I just adored, beautiful African American woman with the beautiful eyes. She just sucked my world in. She says, "You can be part of the security team." And I was always called a little Butch Dyke. And she said, "You'll do good." And we had to wear armbands with the pink triangles and the parade with all of our drag queens going down. It was just a little, maybe a mile long parade. But the police, they stood up on the hills and they could see us, walk in, and they could see people throwing things at us. But again, my job was just to make sure that we all stayed safe. When running, if somebody jumped on someone, we all would have to get out there and, because they'd try to pull the drag queens off the float or something. It was like that was our job. And so I got to do that. So I was very involved in Kansas City from a political standpoint of out and proud, really
Yeah.
out and proud. And yeah, I know. I mean, and I was learning it.
Yes.
And so, and by 1978, the Lyric Theater there had a music event. I'm going to say it was Teresa Troll. I don't really remember which one of the first women were there, but I'm thinking it was her. Whichever one that first brought the sign language in to the music venue. I remember being so impressed that they had somebody that did sign language. But the cool thing about it was I went to it. I thought, oh man, this is a lesbian music, women's music. I'm going. I went. And what was great about it was Marianne was there in
Uh-huh.
the same venue. She didn't live in Kansas City at that point, but she had driven from her small town school to go to that, and here I was there, making sure that just being out and around. And I mean, 6 years later, I will meet Marianne in Kansas City, but at that time, our paths didn't cross. But I was
But
in.
you noticed her.
No, I didn't even notice
Oh,
her.
you didn't notice her.
No, I was
Oh,
looking. I was looking at all of them, Meryl. When you're kind of butchy and very out, you weren't settling with anyone.
right. Being
you're
dyke,
ever
dyke.
you're just being a dyke,
Yeah.
and and that's also the time I learned about lesbian connection.
Oh,
So because they had brought up to that, and so I was starting to get exposed to that world, and I also at that point in 78, that's when I bought my house because I had been renting in the gay ghetto. So I decided I'd go ahead and buy my house in the gay ghetto because I couldn't get a loan. I didn't have a good enough job. I didn't have any money saved up. I didn't have a silver spoon coming my way. But these rundown, boarded up houses, the suburban people wanted to sell them before they burned down. And I bought my house in what would 10 years later become Womontown. And
ah,
I bought the house in 78 in that neighborhood. And the other thing that was going on at that time was there was also the Southern Baptist Convention in 78. Anita Bryant, you
Yep,
know, and through MCC and the other groups, we were down there with the posters of "We Are Your Children" and "Stop the Hate."
yep, yep.
Uh, so that part was going on pretty heavily, and then so I stayed involved in it, and then the AIDS crisis hit in the 80s, 1981, in our church. Um, uh, People started dying and getting sick. And that's when the shift of politics from just trying to get our rights was now just trying to keep our gay men from dying. And the fear of us as lesbians, we were just as fearful. We didn't know if we could get it or not. And I do remember there was a lot going on, and people that were those of us who had been out in the community in some fashion were still out there, but so many people kind of drew back and disappeared back into the closet. It was a rough time. I mean, it was, and the people in that neighborhood in the gay ghetto where gay guys had bought homes too. The MCC church was there, like just up the street, 5 minutes from my house. Uh,
Mhm.
all of a sudden, these houses are now being left vacant because the people were disappearing. They were going back home or they're dying. And our church was trying to, I remember doing fundraisers with them, trying to raise money just to make sure they had blankets or food or transportation to get them to their families. A lot of families wouldn't even take them back though. And it was hard. It was hard watching so many of my friends that I came out with disappear. It was very hard. And even in Womontown today, where our primary home was, right around the corner was one of my best friends, Floyd. It was like he was there today and gone tomorrow. And I remember just thinking, I don't know how to deal with it, but you just did. And that was the 80s, early 80s. And of course, we see where it is still today, you know. And then I think the other thing that was going on in my world at that time was there was the what we called the KCWSG. It was a Kansas City Women's Support Group, and it was the assistant pastor Pam and her partner Trish was who was a good friend of mine. They started that group in MCC, but because of the AIDS situation, they kind of stepped back and I remember him saying, "Would you take it over?" They called me Ski back then. "Would you take it over?" And I said, "I'll take it over, but I'm not going to take it over under the church." I said, "I'll do this. I'll make sure we have our meetings and whatever, but not in the church." And
Mm.
they agreed. And from that point, for the next 10 years, um, I started with it. I will meet Marianne in 1985, just a couple of years later, 1984, and she will have come to that group that I was now facilitating in different women's homes. And because we met monthly, we did retreats, we did canoe trips, we did healing of our lesbian community because so many of us were tired. And so it was a way to kind of integrate playtime. We formed another ball team called the Independent Women through the KCWSG. So we got to go out there, and it was 1985 when they said, "Put me in coach." Well, I was the coach. And at that point, I met Marianne, and I said, "Don't you want to play ball?" you know,
I'll bet you did.
yeah.
And I'll bet she did.
Yeah, she did, and I had just met her in 1984 at Pete's, where I was a part-time ID checker, and it was an odd time too in that sense because in the gay ghetto we were culturally mixed: African American women, primarily lesbians, and poor gay guys, and AIDS, and you know. But at Pete's bar, um, it was the black women went upstairs, the white women stayed downstairs. I was at the door checking IDs, and I can remember thinking, it was crazy. My best, another good friend of mine, Jean Green. I mean, she was one I met at P Flag, and she was dark as chocolate. And she couldn't come in and be on the same dance floor with me. We used to razz about it. We were both butches, and we would just cuss the hell out of Pete. But Pete was and her partner. They had to deal with the politics of the day, and the police would come in to raid the place, and it was bad enough they'd come in just because of the white women, but if there were black women down there too, it was like just stand there against the wall. Don't anybody move or breathe till they're done calling you whatever names they're going to call you. Then they'd
Yeah.
leave. Um, so my activism and so forth was very heavily trenched from Kansas City. I pretty much have always been out. Um, uh, the thing about the Mighty Dike, it was in Kansas City at one of the canoe trips that I came up with the story of Mighty Dike. I even didn't spell it the same way that I do today.
Uh,
And, we just roared about having this character. And so from 85 to present, I still do stories about this special character and then I related it back to in the beginning, I was born, a lesbian, a little Mighty Dyke. So I look at my life like a full circle. And then of course with Marianne Leaf, as y'all know her, she will enter my life in 84, and she will have changed my life for the next 30 years because she will have introduced me to academia, to writers, to readers, to artists, lesbians, feminists. I had none of that as a background. I only had the tradeswoman, rough, tough, protecting side of me. I had that dyke, and I didn't have that feminist. I didn't know who Gloria Steinem was. I will meet her later when we were doing Womontown. I didn't know who any of
yeah.
I just didn't know these people. They weren't in my world. The drag queens were in my world. The rough out people were in my world. The political, keep the police away from us was in my world. We carried $100 bills when in our $100 bill was to always be in your pocket to when the police would raid, so you can go get your friends out of jail before they got hurt.
We called it our emergency money.
Yeah, yeah, you had to have
Yeah.
it. You had to have it. So that's I brought you to the point of where Marianne and I will have met, and from there it will become the story of how we group together these different groups,
Yeah.
how later we will become known for the Womontown and all this other stuff we do. Even today, we are very strong activists.
And writers and activists and
Okay, so I wanted to recap from 1968 to 1972. I was doing nursing home jobs and I was not educated. I was a self starter, but I really got my start from my own business between 1973 and 1990. And I ran a maintenance business from the ground up. I really I met a lot of people in the money world, and that was because they enjoyed having a young dyke doing things for them. And along the way, I got my trade skills: electrical, plumbing, HVAC, and so forth. And so I was able to develop quite a skill level that took me out of that nursing home work and mopping floors to where I actually ended up by 1990. I was running $1 million businesses, getting myself hired as a contractor for the housing authority, and that was for me that was quite the difference. I also went ahead and got myself a real estate license and a broker's license by 1985, which I still hold today to present. I still do real estate work. I wanted to clarify that that there was an educational process thing that took place for 10 years, finding myself during that time, not leaving it hanging that I was just out there mopping floors all that time. I was very active in the MCC and the gay lesbian community, but not necessarily well aware of the lesbian feminist community. I did do pride marches. I was an activist and so forth, but I was again in the trades world with that lower education that wasn't giving me the feminist stuff. Not totally aware of what was going on until I meet Mary Ann, who I met in 1984, 85. And that's why I wanted to bring this up to present, that there was a gap there of learning about the women lesbian community outside the trade community, educational community. So from my age of 27 to 33, my life was just getting myself educated, getting myself a degree, graduating with honors, and moving up so I could deal with the clout that wealthy people expected. When I obviously go into the political world of Womontown, I learn a lot about the lesbian feminists and the politics of it, which makes a big difference in my life. I made two or three career changes, again, because of being in the trades, I was looked at it one way by a certain group of people. And by the time I get to my mid 40s, I'm now in a position where I can demand better salaries and a better security for myself through 1990s into present. I end up doing things, and I will say I make another big shift, and I'm doing things in the spiritual goddess world, setting up a lot of stuff aside from the typical male trade stuff so that we can help grow the effects of Womontown, which is really important for my spiritual growth and for Womontown. The last thing I'd like to mention is that in an earlier, when I was playing with the Mighty Dyke stories, I spelled it. This shows the difference in my education, lesbian feminist. I spelled it Mighty Dyke. But by the time I get to where I really understand the feminist side of things, I spell Mighty Dyke, Myte. Dyke with a full emphasis on the mighty Dyke as opposed to the patriarchal way of spelling it. So that's my recap. I just wanted to clarify that has been a journey. I didn't want to leave it hanging that I never educated myself. I did. I wasn't into the feminist community to the level I'd like to have been, but once I stepped into it, I was there, and that pushed my activism to where I am today, 50 years later. Okay, thanks very much. There you go.